I was having my morning coffee, and I mean, as you can see, I'm still actually even in my gown and stuff. But I was thinking about, well, I mean, it's review season, and the company reviews. There's increases, and there's all of these other things. And I was thinking about this notion because I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the market, and I was thinking about like counter offers. And normally the argument is that you shouldn't actually accept a counter offer because here's the general argument. The general argument is that um, why did it have to take you receiving another offer for them to pay you what you're worth? Yeah. And I was thinking about that notion of that why did it have to take them or you receiving another offer for them to pay you what you're worth? And I'm like, okay, well, this assumption is quite flawed because you're assuming that this new offer from your prospective employer is what you are worth. Um, how do you know that? Because more often than not, this offer that you're receiving from your prospective employer is simply a percentage above what you're making. So let's say 15 or 20%. So um, when I was thinking about this, I'm like, let's say you're making 20,000 and this new employer offers you 25, and then your current employer says, well, I'm willing to offer you 26 and a half for you to stay. And then we come back and we say, why haven't they been paying you 26 and a half all this time? Why haven't they been paying you what you are worth? Well, so we call it. But 26 and a half is not what you're worth. It's just that it is above what your prospective employer is actually offering you. But that doesn't mean that this new counter offer is actually what you're worth. I mean, think about it, because if, for instance, and and it's very difficult to actually arrive at how do you determine what you are actually worth, because there's a number that, let's say, your current employer will not pay you. They will not be willing to offer you that beyond this specific number. Like at that number, beyond this number, it then becomes not worth it for them as a business to actually pay you that amount of money. But you're not sure what this number is. You have no way of knowing, because if you're making 20 and now they're offering you 26 and a half and you say that's what you're worth, well, you've got no way of really knowing that's really what you're worth. Like, how much further was the organization actually willing to go to actually keep you? You have no way of actually knowing that. It's difficult to actually know how much further the organization would have gone to actually keep you. So you then have that problem that you, the argument around whether this 26 and a half is actually what you are worth is a mute one, because it's not necessarily what you're worth. It's what your employer is offering to pay you in order for you to stay. It's not necessarily what you're worth. And the only reason they're offering you this because it's simply above what your prospective employer is offering. And where it normally gets difficult, especially if you're dealing with recruiters and whatever, that's why they hate counter offers so much, is now you get into a bit of a bidding war, because and most people are afraid to do this. Like they won't go back to the prospective employer and say, well, my current employer is actually offering me X. And part of that is because you made it sound like this was not about money, it was about growth. You were looking for a new challenge, blah 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 blah, all the things that you said that got you to the point of you being made an offer now come back to bite you in the backside, because you said this wasn't necessarily about money, it was about other things. And now you're coming back and saying, well, now my current employer that I told you I was looking to move away from, and because I was looking for growth, blah blah blah. No, well, turns out now they're offering me more money, and I'm actually considering staying. It makes you look like you're actually a liar. It makes you look like you're not a person of your word. It makes you look like these things that you were saying aren't necessarily true, and then it casts a thing around you as a person now, and your character is like, okay, what other things have you said that aren't necessarily true? But And when I was having this conversation with this friend of mine, I said to him, I think part of the problem is we we have created a culture in the corporate world where people are actually not allowed to be honest about their desire for financial growth. And with him, I was actually talking about exit interviews, and I'm like, if your exit, like, if money is not in the top three of the reasons why people are leaving your organization, your exit interviews are not honest. That's, I mean, obviously that was just a round number, but when I consider the economy, when I consider many of the articles that you find people that are really struggling with making ends meet and whatever else, one of the easiest ways to increase how much you're making is simply to make a career move. That changing jobs is one of the quickest ways to increase how much you're making. Literally. So if you're an organization that actually has these exit interviews and whatever, and people don't feel comfortable enough to say, to be honest with you, I need the money, and these people are offering more money than, let's say, for instance, it's in review season, than what you guys are offering. That's the truth, you know. And so I was thinking about this a lot, like this idea of being paid what you're worth. Is like there's a number that your employer is willing to pay you, and they cannot possibly pay you above that. Otherwise, it now ceases to be worth it for them. But also, this prospective employer, they also have a number that they would not necessarily go above. And the difficulty is how close to that number is their current offer. You have no real way of knowing that. It's difficult for you to actually know that. I mean, one of the ways is perhaps receiving some pushback from um, the the offer you've been made. Then perhaps it might give you some indication. But the idea that you shouldn't accept a counter offer because um, why did it have to take this other offer for you to then be paid what you're worth is a flawed argument, because this isn't necessarily what you're worth. You don't know what you're worth, you know. And I was actually having another conversation with another friend about 2 weeks ago or something, and that's basically what I was saying to her. I'm like, and I think I've done a post on this before as well. When a company advertises a vacancy, they generally have a budget for this vacancy, and that budgeted number has nothing to do with what you're currently earning, because they don't know what you're currently earning. So they have decided they're looking for someone who can do X amount of responsibilities, and they're willing to pay this amount of money. This number has nothing to do with your current cost to company. Now, what we go and we do, and when I was talking to her about this, I'm like, the conversation for you, generally, you assume that the negotiation starts at the point of an offer, whereas the negotiation starts at the point of you showing interest in the role itself. If you say, okay, this is something I might consider, the negotiation has started. And all information that you reveal either weakens or strengthens an argument for you to be paid either exactly what has been budgeted or above that. Now, if you come in and you don't know what has been budgeted, and you say to, and I mean, this number even that has been budgeted isn't necessarily what you're worth. That's another thing we would then have to actually have a conversation about, that just because an employer has budgeted X doesn't mean you're worth X, because if you've been around long enough, you will have had conversations with recruiters where they say, I've had a situation like this probably about a year or so ago, where they asked me, so what's your current cost? Before I learned not to actually share this, that's probably 18 months ago or something. He said, what's your current cost to company? And I shared that with them. I'm like, I'm earning X. And they said, oh, wait, that's way above what has been budgeted. So yeah, I wouldn't even, like, we can't even continue with this conversation, because like we can't even begin to match what you're currently making, never mind better that, you know. So that conversation ended there. But this number that has been budgeted, you are not aware of this number. More often than not, we don't even ask about it. We actually don't ask about what has been budgeted, you know. Sometimes when I'll say to, let's say, for instance, especially now that I don't share this my current cost to company, because it doesn't make sense. What I've agreed with my current employer has nothing to do with what I'm going to agree with you. So why are we using it as a benchmark? And so generally I'll be pushed about that and say, well, we just want to know whether you are within budget. I'm like, oh, that's actually very easy to find out. Tell me what you've budgeted, and I can tell you based on the job spec whether that's something I'd be willing to consider. Half the time they really don't want to tell you that. But anyway, this budgeted amount has virtually nothing to do with what it has zero to do with what you're currently earning. They may have done some desktop research or whatever else, or even just pulled a number out of nowhere and say, okay, we'll offer them X. But that's not necessarily what you're worth. They've just said, okay, well, let's say we'll budget X, or within the region of about X, and maybe have 5 to 10,000, let's say maybe above that, hopefully. If it's a person that we really love and we really want to get them on board, we might be willing to go a bit above that budget. And then even if you're to receive that number that they've budgeted, that's not necessarily what you're worth. Like the idea of value and being paid what you're worth is such a vague idea, because of the fact that you have to arrive at the question of how did you arrive at the idea that that's what you are worth. So when you say that an employer should have paid you what you are worth, how did you arrive at the conclusion that that is actually what you're worth? Like this new offer that you employ, let's say it's a counter offer, this number that your current employer is offering you, how do you know this is actually what you're worth? You could be worth 10,000 rand more than that. You could be worth 15, you could be worth 20, you could be worth 25. The only reason your employer is willing to make you a counter offer that is, let's say, above or willing to match what you're being offered is that you still haven't reached that maximum number that they would not be willing to go above. That's the only reason you receive a counter offer. But there's a number that an employer will not go beyond. It just doesn't make business sense for them to pay you that number. And more often than not, you will not know what that number actually is. So the idea that this counter offer is really what you are actually worth to the company and whatever else, you're not. The only reason they're making that specific number is that it's just slightly above the other. So there are a lot of flaws in the argument of both counter offers and offers from your prospective employer and saying this is actually what I'm worth. That's why they're willing to pay me this. Well, no, not necessarily. They are willing to pay you that because you haven't, either that is the maximum they are willing to pay, or you haven't yet reached the maximum that would actually be willing to pay someone for that specific role. There's a number that even your prospective employer will not go above. There's a number that your current employer would also not go above. Not because you're not worth that, because at that number it ceases to make business sense to them. In other words, to them you are not worth that number anymore. But that doesn't mean a different employer who's not this one who's just made you an offer, or your current employer making you the counter offer, that they would not be willing to pay a number above that. So I think we need to rethink this idea around counter offers and saying, why have they not paid me what I'm worth ahead of time? Because just because that's what they're offering you doesn't mean that's what you're actually worth. There's actually a lady on my LinkedIn who really did a really good article around how do you decide on an offer? Like, how do you decide on how much you should be paid? And a lot of it is out of thin air. It really isn't a metric. Like, you can't even go to Glassdoor because you don't know how you compare against the people that shared that information on Glassdoor, and you don't know how accurate that number actually is, or Glassdoor or PayScale or any of these other sites. So that becomes difficult to do. A lot of it is about your ability to build an argument around the fact that this amount that you're asking for dwarfs or is almost negligible in comparison to the value that you're actually bringing to the company. So it's really a thing of, can you actually build an argument for why you are worth the number that you say you want? So if you say you want 35, can you build an argument for why this number is almost a non-factor, because of the fact that because of the value, because of this, because of that, and all the other things that you would be bringing to the organization, almost makes this number that you're asking for seem like a bargain. Can you actually build an argument around that? You know, but again, just because a company is willing to pay you that, doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're worth. You know, again, it becomes a thing of what do you feel like um, you should be paid right now, and can you build an argument for that number that another person who actually has to sign the paycheck will agree with? You know, and I think we're so ill-equipped and we're not really taught about this idea of knowing your worth, and also being able to build an argument for that, being able to build an argument for why you think, um, let's say you're worth 40 and not 35. You know, how do you actually do that? How do you actually build an argument around that? And I think so many of us are so ill-equipped around the salary negotiation and being able to actually ask for what we think we deserve, based on the value that we would be bringing the organization. And that is costing us an insane amount of money, because what you've been offered isn't necessarily what you're worth. This counter offer isn't necessarily what you're worth. There is a number that companies may not be entirely happy about paying, but they would actually pay it because of the fact that they agree that based on the value you would be bringing to the organization, this is actually worth that price. And half the time we don't know that number, nor can we build an argument for a number around it. And I think most of the time it's far above what you might think and what you might be led to believe. But more often than not, you don't have the necessary skills, and you don't feel comfortable enough talking about money for you to be able to ask the necessary questions of, let's say, recruiters or prospective employers, and be able to arrive at that specific number that, a specific employer would still feel like you, is worth the price that they're paying because of the knowledge and the skills that you would be bringing to the role. And yeah, a lot of this is just it's new ideas that I now have about this idea of being paid what you're worth. Like, it's very difficult for you to actually say that this counter offer is actually what you're worth, because you don't know what you're worth. You would actually have to spend some time thinking about that, doing your research and finding out what other employers and whatnot would actually be willing to pay someone with your knowledge and your skills, and your experience, for specific types of roles and specific types of jobs. So the idea that this counter offer is what you're worth isn't necessarily true. You know, I'm actually eager to hear what you guys might be thinking about this idea of counter offers and it being paid, and you being paid what you're worth. Like, how do you decide what you're worth? How did you arrive at that number? How did you arrive at the conclusion that this number is actually what you're worth and not what you're currently earning, or not what this prospective employer is offering, or even this counter offer that you're receiving from your current employer? How do you arrive at the conclusion of knowing what it is that you are worth?